everyone. Looks like we've got a good packed house. That's awesome. Thank you for coming. We're excited to have with us Matt Blackwell tonight to talk about his brand new exhibition, which I recognize some of you from last night. No, it just opened last night, called Worry Later. We're especially excited to have Matt because we absolutely love his unbounded creativity. Just so you know, the show is loosely based on a musical theme, but much with all of Matt's work, there are many layers and many influences embedded in every painting. For example, the painting Worry Later, which is the big car on the opposite wall when you walk in, it's a scene we're all familiar with. Snowstorm coming in, socking in your car, and all you can do is just say, well, I'll worry about it later when the storm ends. But it's also a title of a Thelonious Monk song, and if you look closely on the hood of the car, there's a little black burning candle, and that is Matt's tribute to reggae legend Lee Perry's song, Worry Later. So that's one of the great things about Matt's paintings. The strong narrative sense of them draws you in immediately, and if you're willing to stick around for a while, you just get more and more out of them. So obviously everyone here in the gallery, we're live. You can ask Matt questions during the talk, but we're also live streaming on Facebook, and if you have a question on Facebook, just type it into the comment section and we'll read it to Matt here in the gallery. And just so you all know, if you ever miss a talk, they're all live streamed on Facebook. Facebook automatically saves them, so if you go into our videos on Facebook, you'll see all the talks. And then Reggie gets us back a clean version of the video, and we post it on our YouTube channel. So all our exhibition videos, all our artist talks, all those kind of events are all on our YouTube channel. So if you want to keep up with that, just hit subscribe. So now before I turn it over to our guest of honor, just a few biographical words about Matt. He got his BFA from the Portland School of Art, which is of course now Mecca. Lost for Mecca. And he got his MFA from the University of North Carolina, where he received the Holderness Fellowship for Excellence. He was also the recipient of the Marguerite Zorak Scholarship in Painting at Skowhegan. And he's also received a Guggenheim Fellowship. His work's in the permanent collections of the Portland Museum of Art. You probably have all seen that wonderful big painting with a moose with the butterfly wings for horns, or for antlers. And his work's also in the Everson Museum of Art, the Savannah College Museum of Art and Design, as well as in many private collections. So please welcome Matt Blackwell.
Well, thanks for coming out tonight. I know it wasn't easy today. I was kind of looking at it, and coming back here, it's always the elements of the weather, how much it plays in people's lives in Maine. I think it maybe helped to drive me out at some point, about 86. But I loved being up here in the time that I was here. And, going to Portland School of Art, just had such great teachers with Ed Douglas, Joan Uranak, John Ventimiglia, Bill Collins, just to name a few people. But it also, I made so many good friends here that it continues to pull me back as much as I can, which isn't that often, but at least in the summer for a week. And the work that I come up and draw, because I can give myself over to the main scene very easily, the light, the forms, the people, but a little bit of that I've been dragging around behind myself for all these years, in the 40 years that I left. I left in 86, and I thought about coming back. I was teaching at USM, and they told me they'd rehire me if I got an MFA, but then a whole bunch of other things happened. And I ended up in Cleveland for 2 years after Greensboro, and that was good, because only Cleveland could have got me ready for Brooklyn. And, it was like, it's pretty down on its knees, but also a great place where you could find plenty of teaching work and, plenty of hardware stores. So Cleveland was kind of the same way. And Brooklyn was kind of the same way. Very working class, and plenty of materials, and I'm showing you paintings, but for the first 10 years that I was in New York, I just made sculpture pretty much. I made paintings, but I couldn't get them shown. Nobody was showing paintings. And I thought that I'd be welcomed with open arms as an expressionist painter because of Basquiat and because of the Germans, but that wave had already passed. I was a little late. But still, there were so many galleries in Soho, so I stayed on. And I worked as an art handler for about 8 years, packing art and seeing collections and driving it around to wherever it had to go. So I learned a lot about the contemporary art world in New York, and in those days there were so many galleries. Now it's post-pandemic, it's a little more blown out. But just a little about me. I grew up in Western New York State, in Lyons, New York, just north of Geneva. It's a Erie Canal town. My mom was a painter. She collected a lot of antiques. My dad had a big band in high school, piano player, but ended up being the phys ed teacher at my school and kind of a great basketball coach who always had championship teams. My brother was a saxophone player, kind of playing straight ahead jazz. So there was music all the time in the house. So it became an important part, but you know, it just seemed normal to me. It just seemed normal to me. And everybody was off in the corner of the house making stuff, and me at an early stage making model cars, just because it was a typical kid. And, but I was lucky enough to have a great high school art teacher who later went on to RIT and taught art education. And he taught me a lot about painting from high school on. So I knew it was what I wanted to do. I never wanted to do anything else. And I already had kind of the practice from home. So it was a studio situation almost. So it's taken me years to figure that out, but that's kind of how it was. So let me just check myself here and see if I'm missing anything. I've been Zoom teaching, and for the last 2 years at LaGuardia Community College, which is a great school and great kids. It has the most diverse student body in the United States. I have kids from all over, from Tibet, from the Dominican Republic, from Venezuela, from you name it, and just city kids, which I taught city kids through studio in a school for 8 years at an elementary school level before after I got done art handling. And that was fantastic. It was so rewarding. There was so much freedom in their work. Show me a second grader who isn't a genius. But it also made me yearn for more freedom in my own work. And I think that's why I left Maine, that I wanted to move on to something else. I mean, I loved Maine, and I could give myself over to the landscape. These are a couple of Monhegan paintings, and I'm just going to old time just flash these at you, and it's just the back of a studio on Monhegan. That the subject matter was everywhere. You didn't have to go far. You could do a 360 on your heel, and there was another painting. I was lucky enough to have a friend who introduced me to the island. This is also typical of just going out and painting light and shadow, and ask a friend to just stand in the foreground. It's kind of an August painting. So plein air painting. I was really interested in George Bellows, and I did that for 4 years seasonally from May till October, and then I'd go to Pownell, Maine in the winter where my girlfriend and I were living with another couple and had a small farm. So I learned a little bit about small farming in Maine, about how to raise some animals and split a lot of wood, and was around a bunch of musicians. They were all musicians, I wasn't. The math always threw me. I wished I was a musician. But they were playing a lot of Irish traditional stuff, but also French Canadian, and that house became kind of a hub for people coming through with big musical sessions there that were incredible. Like guys like Eugene O'Donnell and Mick Maloney came there and blew the roof off the house, and I was the only non-musician with a whiskey and just sit and listen, and it was fantastic. So it was rich days in those days, and I'm not going to go on too long about them, but you know, another friend in front of a car, so you kind of see the beginnings of what I've done with cars. You know, I like them as ultimate forms. I'm not that nostalgic about them. I like them, but I just think that the forms are fantastic, and they're such an absolute form that I need that every once in a while. I can't move them in New York. New York is car-phobic, I think. Yeah, they don't want anything to do with cars. They think I'm on some nostalgia trip, but I'm not really. I just like them as forms. It could be a chair, and I've got a lot of chair paintings too. So that's kind of what was going on. This is the last Monhegan painting, and it's just out at the East End. I forget what that point is called. Billy could tell me, but I'm not sure. I don't remember. But you know, we used to go down there and swim, and the light on the water. It's just you just give yourself over to it. Go out with a little French easel. So you know, for me, place is really, really important. And when I got to Cleveland, I started to make more invented landscapes. This is another car. This is when I first got in New York. And you know, I was really interested in expressionist painting. People were saying, don't put words in them, don't put words in them. But I said, I don't care. You know, it's like, it's pretty much, if you're an artist, you kind of get used to indifference. So why not paint them for yourself? If somebody else likes them, then great, you know? So this kind of industrial landscape, I was around this a lot, and I could kind of conjure it up from painting all those landscapes in Maine. I wouldn't have to have a source or anything. I could just come up with it. And I think I learned that from Ed Douglas, particularly through Richard Diebenkorn, who he studied with, that invented landscape. I was really interested in doing that. So I'm not always doing a lot of research in terms of the settings. They just kind of come up. And I was continuing to paint even though I was making sculpture. I make tin sculptures, and I could get in group shows with those. So I went that way, and I kept painting. And then maybe in 2000, after a couple of residencies up at Skowhegan, not Skowhegan, Yaddo, and Vermont Studio Center, I started to get some interest from Ed Thorpe, who was a great New York dealer, and who very painterly gave Eric Fischel his start, and Deborah Butterfield, just to drop a couple names, but he had a really good eye. So I started a show with him, and was with him for 15 years till he closed down. And you know, Kathy Bradford was in there, a number of other people, Judy Linares, all people who really started to influence me too, especially Judy, because she'd come from Bay Area. She'd been in San Francisco, and I think she knew Joan Brown. She knew that whole circle of California artists who I love. I love David Park. I love Richard Diebenkorn, Joan Brown, Jay DeFeo. I could go on. Elmer Bischoff. That you know, and I always wish that I'd gone out there and gone to grad school. I wrote Elmer Bischoff a letter once, my only fan letter, and I got a beautiful letter back from him on 1960s stationery that I still have somewhere. And he told me where I could find reproductions, because it was the days when you couldn't find reproductions. But that was great, and I thought I entertained it, but Greensboro came up, so I went down there and made a lot of paintings, and kind of more expressionist paintings, and really kind of working off Eric Fischel, but also German expressionists. I brought them to New York and showed them to somebody, and they said, well, these are an awful lot like Eric Fischel. And she kind of stepped on me, but it was good. It was good for me to hear that. So I knew I had to shift gears again and find another way to show work, because if you're making derivative work in New York, people will call you out. There's only so far you can go with it. But I just feel like there have been so many people who've influenced me that after a while you start to develop a system of how you would make things. So I'll just start with this painting, and I'm going to get on with this, talking about paintings. That a painter named Amy Sillman, who's this great New York painter, there was an interview with her, and she said, I didn't know how to paint a figure, so I just thought of it as a pile of lumber. And I thought, yeah, because I think that some of painting and some of being an artist, you got to give up what you know. You got to, and that's painful. It's like you got to break your habits. You still have them, and it's like you have to unlearn them every time you go in the studio. They come back, and you have to kind of stiff arm them and move on. So anyway, what she said about lumber, I thought, well, I'm going to make this figure out of lumber, and I want it to be stiff. And it was the same time as the Gulf War. Guys coming back from the Gulf War, but also Afghanistan with severe wounds. And I've got a friend who goes out and photographs all over New York, and he said, geez, he goes, I can't believe how many guys I see with artificial legs walking down the street, young guys. I said, uh-huh. So I thought, I'm going to put that in here a little bit, just because that's concerning, and some of it seems so unnecessary that I've always liked the German expressionists, and in particular Max Beckmann, Otto Dix, George Grosz, that they kind of showed the time that we live in, but particularly Beckmann, that he lived in such a dark time in Germany, lost his professorship in '33, stayed on till I guess 37, and then escaped to Amsterdam and painted out the war there. But he always seemed to have something. There's so much mystery in that work. It's like you'll never decipher it, but you really get the feel for what it must have been like in those days. So I felt like we were on dark days too, so I decided to try to infuse that a little bit. And I was reading a lot of books about, by Russell Banks, just about rural characters who were in desperate situations. Somebody just reminded me of Jim Harrison too. I was reading a book called Brown Dog, which is about a Native American guy in the Upper Peninsula. And it talks about how he lives and gets by, and yeah, they were sympathetic to me. Just because they were such outsiders. So I kind of think of that as the outsiders, but also living in Pownell for a while, kind of seeing outsiders and dealing with people who were putting things together. I always respected that about Maine people, that they'd have 2 or 3 different jobs. You know, they might be clamming, they might be painting houses, they might do interior carpentry in the winter, and they had know-how. So I want to put those kind of guys into my paintings. And I had a mechanic in Pownell who had a wooden leg or a prosthesis, but he also had an airport. So he flew planes, and he had this old Mercedes that he'd drive around, but I'd take my old junker truck over there, and he'd work on it, and I'd knock on the door, and it would be like a bong inside there. All the smoke would come tumbling out, and I'd say, Harold, is my truck done? He'd say, no, so that's okay, all right, I'll be back, I'm not rushing you. And, it was really interesting characters. So I want that kind of thing in the work a little bit, that is kind of humorous, it's kind of dark. And just to continue that story, I heard a story after I left Pownell that he had crashed and gotten killed at the airport, but his sons had to pull up all the pot plants out there before they called the state police. So I thought that was kind of beautiful tribute to Harold. That kind of dark humor, I like it. This one is It's called Whiskey River, which is kind of after all kinds of people have had Whiskey River songs. You know, if I was a diving duck, I'd dive to the bottom and I'd never come up Whiskey River, but also Willie Nelson. And I had these two separate paintings. My mom had sent me, when she moved out of, she had been in upstate New York, but my dad moved to Florida. My dad passed away. She decided to move to Santa Fe with my brother, and she had a beautiful chest that she had painted. And she says, "Is there anything you want?" I said, "I want the chest." Well, she shipped me the chest with about 10 jugs inside of it. It ended up costing me $1,000, but I love the jugs. And they're all from my hometown, which was a big pottery place in the 1850s on the Erie Canal. It was an incredible agricultural port. So I don't know, they had these as two separate paintings, but I put them by each other one night in the studio, and I went, yeah, those kind of work as a narrative together. So I've been combining paintings. It's a little bit like making movies. There can always be something more to the story. And I did a January 6th painting that's 11 panels because there was so much, January 6th for the insurrection of, almost a dozen panels because there was always so much more to put in it. And, I like that kind of idea of filmmaking, and some of my images have started to come from film, from TV, and that's so far away from where I started here in terms of just painting from nature. But it's another source, and I really appreciate movies. I love film noir. There's a painting out in the other room that's kind of that called Burning Car that is called Panic. I forget what the title is, but it came from a movie called Panic in the Year Zero. Ray Milland and Frankie Avalon, an apocalyptic movie of 1963. So I don't know where it's going to come from. I don't know where sources might be, just everyday conversations and the things that you hear from people. I think that it gets infused into the work, and I'm more open to it the older I get. This painting down here is called Lucinda, and I started it out just as painting. A lot of times it's probably going to be a figure, so I start painting a figure and it's a nude, and I think, I can't show that. I can't show that. Nobody's going to want to see that. Or else somebody's going to want it, and then someone in the family is going to object. So I've had it happen. So I just decided that, I'll put some clothes on her. And then it turned into Lucinda Williams, kind of. I'm not that literal, but I love her as an artist because she has so many voices. She can be just as rough as anything. She can be as sweet as anything. She can do country, she can do gospel, she can do jazz. And she has as many voices as like Bob Dylan. Some people might say Bob Dylan has one voice, and it's bad, but I like it, and I like all the different things that he can do with it. And now as a geezer, the things that he does with it. So anyway, my mother ended up out in Santa Fe with my brother, who'd been there for 40 years. Working as a piano tuner and technician, very good button accordion player, kind of French tunes, but I just started to know the area from being out there. And, exit ramps, this kind of undersized exit ramp. I was interested in the change of scale that could happen in a painting that, Beckman gets away with these giant hands and little tiny heads. And it's like somehow it works. I believe it. And it's you're always looking for a version telling a story. I think I'm not that much of a literalist, and so I like making her kind of giant, that she would loom over the landscape. And there's collaged flowers in this painting. It started out as an acrylic painting, so I said, well, I'm having trouble painting these flowers. I think I can get a better flower by just using a flower. So I collaged them on and put a bunch of polymer over there, stuck right to the canvas, and then I started working back into it with oil. But before I did that, I started to put some collage elements into this, and it's just crap that was sitting around in the studio. But somehow you feel like it works. You know, and I've also begun to put drawings into paintings on the edge of canvas, just because there's always more to tell. There's always more to tell. There's always more to the story. And, you know, before she had a bunch of characters, but she just ended up with the devil. And she's out there, and it says Santa Fe, and she's trying to get up there, and there's a halo of flowers around her head. She has some of her belongings with her. And, you know, death comes and takes a sniff, because I feel like in the Southwest, it's particularly haunted in a certain way. There's a certain amount of native witchcraft that I like the idea, mixed with Catholicism. But even the area that I grew up in is kind of steeped in spiritualism, early spiritualism of people heading west out through New York State. And both my mom and my aunt were interested in that stuff, so it was kind of in the air a little bit. And I don't know, there's a little gallows kind of thing over here that has some bottles on the top of it, and I'm not quite sure what this plan is. And you know, it's very general in terms of the vegetation, because I'm not that much of a thing painter. I'm a lot more of a light painter. You know, to me, there's two ways to teach drawing or painting, and that's either as thing or as light. And I'm a lot more in favor of light because maybe it's less obsessive, and it's easier to get through to the students in terms of color mixing. And it's kind of what I learned at PSA. So, and you know, paint as stuff. That there's that element in paintings that I really like, and I think it's the second element in terms of like looking at paintings, that you look at the narrative, which was kind of discouraged where I went to school at PSA, but not completely. And then you look at the paint, and you know, how's the paint handle? How's it moved around? What is it? It's just such beautiful viscous stuff that it's like, how are you putting it on? With a brush, with a knife? So if you go back to these two paintings that are on the wall, they're kind of just really viscous, fast paintings. And it's easy to do on a smaller scale because you can be so more extravagant with the paint, rather than in a big painting where you think about troweling on, you know, $100 worth of cadmium red. I'm probably going to hesitate a little bit, you know. But if it's that scale, then I can hit it hard, and might even be working painting flat because it goes on in a different way than if it's on the wall. You know, going from here to here is always a challenge to get enough on the brush and get it on, but if it's flat, I can work up a surface really fast, and I can see what's going on. And you know, some of it's knife, some of it's brush, some of it's getting scraped off with razor blades, just a flat edge razor blade that I like because it brings a graphic mark to it. I'm a printmaker too, and I like removing. Sometimes the best stuff is what you remove, you know, especially if it gets really, really thick. You know, if it starts to impede what the painting wants to be. And those are the decisions I think that you're making when you're painting, is what's it want to be? And it's always kind of different, so it's kind of a quandary. You paint up to a certain point, and then you hit a dead end, and you have to put it away. So a lot of these paintings came up over years, especially the bigger ones. They may have had the initial idea, the initial start, like that painting down there. That was the initial idea. Figures came after. But it doesn't always stay like that. It doesn't always stay as an illustration. This painting that's here of Ophelia in the water was another painting that was vertical. And it probably was 2 or 3 other paintings before I hit on this. I'd made other paintings of Ophelia, and I always liked the idea that you could tweak myth, that Ophelia would be swimming away, that she's not, you could make her like not a tragic figure. She could be doing the backstroke, you know? So why not? Why not mess with that? And it's like, my formal education was, it was okay, but I'm always discovering things. Like somebody might say, you should look at the goddess Calliope. And then I go, oh, Calliope, let me look that up. And it's like, yeah, Wikipedia. Yeah, I like that. Images of Calliope. So, but, you know, in terms of the image and the name, it always stuck with me from the band, Ophelia, you know, which is, why do the best things always disappear? Ophelia, please come back home, which I love those guys. And they're a big influence on me too, because as band members, it's the perfect name for them, they're seamless. It isn't solos that much, it's a little bit, but as a band, it's so cohesive. So how do you make something that's, try and get it cohesive so that a lot of voices can get heard, or a lot of sections can get heard, and clearly. So I think that's the game, but it could always be changing too. So like that painting, I don't even remember what was underneath it, but there's 2 paintings under that. And some of it helped me along, you know, like what was left from before. I went, yeah, I'm gonna use that green, that looks really good, I'm using it. There's something about cutting in, and that's my favorite part of painting really, is like getting a big brush and just cutting into it. That great things happen. That painting that's out on the wall, on this far wall that's called Pale Rider, has oil-based enamel in it, radiator paint, really. And it's great, it covers like a demon. So all my sins, they're covered. And I can cut in, and that's a painting that worked a lot of different ways. I love early Demoncorn when he's in Albuquerque, and you can see that he's spinning the painting. He's working it this way, and then he flips it this way, and he negates what's happened. There's starting to be a figure, and he negates it. And he stops short. And you know, there's another great German painter named Albert Oehlen who does the same thing, but even more extremely. There might only be one little section that looks figurative in his work, and all the rest is this meandering. So I love him, and some people just can't stand him. I understand it, because it's so inconclusive, but as far as painting goes, it's so beyond me. I just am amazed by it. So let me talk about this real quickly. And I started this, I got a fellowship to Vermont Studio Center in 2001, and it was after 9/11, and I was ready to get out of the city. I had had enough. It was just like, it was kind of traumatic. It was so traumatic in terms of how many people had died, and the posters that were up of missing people, and the quiet, and nothing was working. And so somebody couldn't come, and they asked me, do you want to come? And I said, sure. So I went up in late October, and it was a warm fall. It was just a New England glorious Indian summer that I could be out walking all the time. So I did a lot of walking. The Portland Museum of Art has got one of those paintings of a guy walking called Winter Stealing the Sun. A bunch of good paintings came out of it, but this got started, and it's just Pan and Flora. I love Flora as a figure, and something too about aging, that, you know, Indian summer, there's something so melancholy but sweet in the sweetest days, you know, as you get older, where you just kind of go, wow, if you could just hold on to this, that these are the golden days in a lot of ways. And I can see that whittling right down into, you know, the rest of your life. That's why it's so great to come up to here, and it's just like, I'm just stupefied by what I see in vacant lots here. The weeds that are left and the color that I'm in. I could throw myself back into that pretty easily. But, I took some photos, I made some paintings, I happened to take a walk, and this kind of adventure walk outside of the compound, and to kind of think of these things as walkabout. I got that when I was living on Monhegan. You're always finding things. But here, I had to cross this stream that had two waterfalls that were beautiful. It was outside of town, and it took me up into an orchard, which was very similar to where I grew up, which is a big fruit growing area in western New York State. I think it's still the second biggest fruit producer in the country, apples in particular. So there were these apple trees, and I just was like stupefied. I had my French easel, I sat down, I made a watercolor sketch. It rained. The watercolor got rained on, got better. And some woman came out of her farmhouse to check me out, and I said, just painting, So I took a few photographs, and then I started to work this up in the studio. And I just loved the apples that were falling on the ground, and the figures came after. They came back after a studio, and after working in the studio at home, but it took me years. I started in 2001, ended it in 2015, and this figure changed so many times. I just couldn't come up with it. Head's too small, this, that, all the problems that come up is for a painter. So, but I like working that big, and this again has aluminum paint on it, which somehow fit the season up there. That the atmosphere was not describable. So as I looked at it more and more, I thought, man, that was like aluminum paint, and I started to slip it in more and more. It's got a lot of little hidden things in here. There's a little Trump head that ended up coming in here, just because I got to deal with it in some way. And that showed up, and there's a little Ku Klux Klan guy in here coming up, and it's like, everything isn't perfect. There's little weird stuff. There's a little goat over here that might be a self-portrait, and he's got a little white goatee, and there's something over here. There used to be some bears. I don't know if they're still in there. I think they are. I think they're kind of right in here. There's another figure here, but you can hide that stuff. And I always like the edge of the woods because it looks like doors. And what's behind those doors? If you were to walk in between two trees and walk a straight line, what will you come across? And in Pownell, I would do things like that, little fun games. And it's more full chroma. It's a little more illustration than what I usually do. But at the same time, I was up in Vermont. I found out my mom had to have a serious operation, and I started to think about her. And she was a great landscape painter and could really paint trees. And so it's kind of a homage to her in a certain way. And it's got more of her hand than I usually come up with. I don't usually make things that are that illustrational, especially in terms of the branches in the tree, but sometimes you're going to do that. Other things get worked up. Pan shows up in a painting. He shows up in this painting, and he sits and he looks at the beautiful goddess standing by the edge of a pool. And they're just little paintings. They kind of happen when I'm short on time and attention span. That happens. It can't always be these orchestrated big paintings. So, but they give me a devil of a time a lot of times, and they take forever to finish. I'm just making them up. And what do I know about the figure? What can I change? What colors do I? Sometimes it's just what colors do I want to put together. Like I've got a Indian yellow. I want an Indian yellow with a purple. And that might be the only impetus towards making the painting. And then these figures kind of come up, and it's like you can't hold them back. You have these cast of characters, and they show up. And I think that the same thing's true with like somebody like Beckman. These figures keep showing up, and I'm interested in stagecraft in a certain way, you know? Somebody just gave me a book on the Threepenny Opera, just the dialogue of that of Brecht's dialogue, and it's great. It's great. I love it. I love it. And it, you know, it's kind of reflective of some of the. I don't know if I could go on about that. There's a couple other small paintings over here that are collage. They've got collage in them, and again, maybe a little bit unorthodox materials like sign painter's color. The turquoise in that top paint is sign painter's color, which is called One Shot, and it's fantastic. It just makes an absolute solution. It's just, you know, it just bangs it down. And then there's another figure below of kind of a star woman, and she has some collage elements coming off her. And this includes like even paint bookers, little paint bookers that get stuck back on I find that burnt umber is a great glue. It holds the paint and dries fast. But palette scrapings on the top one, and I think I put them onto the wet enamel on top, and a little bit of a woodcut, little piece of woodcut, these little shards of things that show up. I'm kind of liking putting those into the paintings, and that happens as well as the painting on the left-hand side, which is called Refugee, that just has a woman with a box on her head with her belongings. It's kind of similar to Lucinda. Lucinda carries her, she has the box on her head, but I think she has a look that's hopeful. And you know, I did the Guggenheim money. I took some of that money and went out to Santa Fe and rented a motel, a little groovy little motel called the Silver Saddle, and found a studio for $100 on the outskirts of Santa Fe that just offered up so much. I stayed there for a month, but some of the best things I saw were just out on Cerrillos Road, which circles the city. On one side is kind of a commercial strip where this motel was, of just people walking by. And I'd see a lot of Mexican guys and Central American guys just going down that highway because there was a men's shelter. So I got all these paintings out of it of guys like hauling their belongings around. And in that Southwest setting, which I really like to paint because there's so little stuff there, that when you put an object in it, it has significance that's probably beyond what it really is, but it feels like it has the significance. It's like that movie Paris, Texas, where you see Harry Dean Stanton walking down the railroad tracks. And it's like there's nothing else, and you just go, what's going to happen next? And you know, I kind of like that. I kind of like that in painting. It's like, what's going to happen next? That kind of trigger, and I hope that they have different feelings all the time, that something like this one day might seem grave, and other days might seem a little funny, you know, a little hopeful in kind of a downcast way, but maybe realistic. And that's what I hope to keep. Or other days, maybe you're just looking at the paint. You're looking and going, cobalt violet, my favorite, you know, at $135 for this big of a tube, you know, that it's like, that's good stuff. And I like it when you see in these other paintings, you see like little bits of snow. I started to put snow in because where I grew up, it was lake effect snow all the time. So I feel like that's part of who I am, that I'm a northern guy really. And, I feel like I've had to move away a little bit for business to New York, but I'm always drawn back to these places. I'm always thinking about them. I daydream Maine all the time, particular places. And weather. I just love weather. Today was great, even though it was hell to be out driving in. You know, we were driving around a little bit, and it was like, God, the big wakes coming up from SUVs, completely blind. I forget how much weather rules, Maine, that it's the season rules everything. And just how quiet it is and how peaceful, so it's great to come back. And, there's more paintings in the other room, but I think it's too hard to get out there and talk about them. If you have questions about them, I can talk to you about them. You know, it's the Southwest, Western New York State, in Maine that show up in my paintings. That I never quite know what the setting's going to be. But it always seems to be a particular place or a certain time of the year. And I favor this kind of weather. I like this, So that's kind of what I'm trying to infuse into the work, as well as characters. And often the characters are at a point where they've got to make a decision. Something has to happen. What's going to happen to them next? And I want that to be compelling in terms of the story. And I think that the story can kind of go anywhere. And it's like, well, even with sex, that, that little starman down there seeing that woman, that could start to show up in paintings. And why not? I mean, when you look at Beckman and Matisse and Picasso, it's loaded. Why not? That's definitely part of the narrative of life. So, it can meander into that. And I think I'm probably about done talking about these things in here. What? Questions? Yeah. So any questions that anyone has, and I'll come back here to get you. Yeah. Yeah, Reggie.
Comment on the picture in the museum, the girl sitting on the bear's
Say it again, sorry.
The painting in the museum,
Yeah.
the girl sitting on the bear's lap. Can you comment on that?
Well, it's sex. And, pure and simple, and it's like, but it's also kind of untamed, that the bear is untamed, and the woman's hardly civilized. So it's like, I kind of like that people would be untamed, or a bear would be untamed, or maybe it's a man, I don't know, but it's like, that people could be a little wild. And, does that answer it? Kind of. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
What neighborhood in Brooklyn was that you lived in? In Brooklyn, what neighborhood?
I live in South Williamsburg, which is down by the Navy Yard, and it's a Hasidic neighborhood, so it's it's pretty easy to be anonymous. You're not really interacting that much. I shop in some of the Hasidic shops, and I have friends in the community, but it's very loose. And but I live in an industrial building down there that's I saw from another building when I moved into the neighborhood, and went out and checked it out and talked to the old Hasidic landlord, and he said, "No living," and I said, "No, of course not." And I moved in the next day, and it wasn't a problem. And the building had loft law situations, so we all got rent stabilized after a fight with the landlord because they didn't have a C of O on the building. But that basically said if artists are supporting the building, that you can't kick them out. And if you know Elliot Barowitz, who summers up here, he got that whole thing started down in Soho because that's what was happening to artists. So I know a lot about tenant law and loft law. So, I was fortunate enough. I live in a great community. I've always kind of had a great community around me, supportive, other artists living in the building, but a lot of nice young people too who managed to get rent stabilization because the landlord was pulling some kind of sleazy things, and they caught him at it. So their lawyer said, "Guess what? You're going to be rent stabilized." So the whole building is rent stabilized. We're a wicked pain in the ass to him, but it's a good group of people. We all talk to each other. We look out for each other, and it's a little bit untouched by the influx of the wealth that's come into the neighborhood and the steel and glass towers were a little bit removed, so that's good, because the character of the whole place just changed. Before, it was the artists. It was the same way that Portland was in the 70s. You know, the artists owned the city. You know, we were all paying like $72 a month and working a part-time job because it was so easy to be poor and you know, have a creative thing going on. But what a place to move into. It was incredible. You know, you could live the richest life, you know. You know, Maine shrimp from Paul's Food Center and scallops every night. You could afford to buy it. So it was, for young artists, it was a great place. Yeah, any other questions? Yeah.
I was looking at these works over time and thinking about how you're dealing with timely and timeless. I'm fascinated by that.
Yeah.
And I think that you're handling really dark or sometimes really intense subject matter
Yeah.
with warmth. And I think that may take something out of timely or the narrative that's timely.
Yeah, I'm interested in that. You know, I'm interested in that, and I'm especially interested in a guy who's like a songwriter like Bob Dylan, because you never know where he's going to set a song, and or what character he's going to take on in terms of the narrative. You could be on the Titanic, you could be out west, you could be just about anywhere. That kind of flow, or the ability to drop into those different things, that there's so much freedom in it, that I'm very interested in that. And you know, I'm kind of, you know, I thought about calling this show Guided by Voices, and I would have maybe talked more about music. We try to use that musical theme, but I'm very guided by music. And especially like the early recordings of Bob Dylan with a band, the basement tapes, that's like my gospel. You know, I keep going back to it. I'm from a small town where I kind of knew those characters. You know, it just kind of bumps along, and I was in a jug band in high school, and it's just kind of, just that kind of goofing around. That just with that goofing around, you can start to conjure things up, locations, whether they're dark or whether they're light. It can be the same kind of thing in a Bob Dylan song, you know, just a line like, two-time in Jim, who is him? I'll drag his corpse through the mud. You just kind of go, well, okay. You know, it's funny, but it's also so dark that you just go, holy mackerel, it's like a Western. So, you know, I'm interested in phrases like that that might evoke paintings, but I'm not that interested in illustrating them. I just think that it points the way to something. Yeah. So any other questions? Did I answer your question?
Yes, and I love it. And I love that you found hope in the refugee's eyes.
What? Say it again?
The hope in the refugee's eyes.
Yeah, well, you know.
It's almost like a decision.
Yeah, well, you know, you see people and it's like so much courage to leave that, to walk through those jungles, to try and find a better life. I can't blame anybody, you know, especially with the way things are in some countries. It's like, I'd be getting out too. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks so much for coming.
Yeah.